Hello, yeah. Hello, everyone. So welcome to this session. So we're going to talk about the state of the humanitarian system 2018. So we're going to have a few panelists today. We're going to have a conversation, and we'll also have a presentation from Paul, which is the author of this report. And then we'll try to have some time for you to be able to ask questions because we really want this session to be a discussion. So maybe to start, well, maybe I should introduce myself. It's the first time I'm a moderator. And actually I'm replacing François Audet, who was supposed to be here. He's the director of OCCAH, l'Observatoire des crises humanitaires. I don't know what's in English. There is a name in English, I don't know. The Observatory of Humanitarian Crisis of Canada. Research Institute for Humanitarian Crisis and Aid. We have the associate director here, so she will be able to speak a little bit more about it. So yes, he was supposed to be here today, and he has an emergency, so he couldn't be here, so I'm replacing him. It is the first time for me to be a moderator, and my name is Coline Camier. I'm a project officer in Humanitarian Aid, and I work for CECI, the Center for International Studies and Cooperation. We are based in Montreal, and we work in about 10 countries usually. So we have a development program, a volunteer program, and a humanitarian program. Okay, so maybe a little bit of context about the ALNAP, because that's what we're here to talk about. So the ALNAP is a network, a global network for 105 organizations all around the world, which is international NGO and national NGO, international and national organization. Also the donor community, the Red Cross movement, some academics. And it came actually around the same time as FEAR, formed around after the failure from Rwanda. So we learned from a crisis that we didn't respond correctly. So the goal was to learn a little bit more and to improve the sector in general and globally. So that's the purpose of the ALNAP, is to learn, improve the quality, and of course to share knowledge between membership. So one of the main activities is this report that comes every 5 years. It's putting together all kind of information to know a little bit more about the sector in general and how we respond to crisis in general. What is their strength and what are the weaknesses of the sector in general, so we can have a portrait and understand better. So that's what we're going to do this afternoon, because this report covered the period from 2015 to 2017. But we'll have Paul talking more a little bit about that. And maybe I should present you after Paul's presentation. Yeah, I think that makes more sense. So I will invite you, Paul, to come. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm on, yeah. Can you hear me at the back? Great. Now, forgive me, I'll just move this a bit. Can you still hear me at the back? Yes. Great, thank you. Okay, let's just, the clicker for this is there, marvelous. So, thank you so much. Oh, they're tall in Canada, aren't they? Maybe we'll just pop that there. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for asking me to present today. It's really marvelous to be in a situation with so many humanitarians and so much experience. So, you know, I do hope that you will be able to consider and critique some of these findings on the basis of your knowledge of what's going on. What I'm here to do, obviously, is to talk about this edition, the 2018 edition of the State of the System report. As with previous editions, Sorry. As with previous editions, the report does basically three things. It covers humanitarian need, so it provides a summary of humanitarian need and gives an overview of the resources that are available to meet those needs. It gives a description of the current size and structure of the humanitarian system. And thirdly, it gives a detailed assessment of system performance. The findings cover a 3-year period, and that's basically January 2015 to December 2017. So it doesn't go into things that happened last year. They're based on a variety of different inputs, synthesis of 200 evaluations, 500 interviews with key informants, 5 field case studies, which were conducted by Group URD, and surveys of both 5,000 aid recipients and 1,170 field personnel. The analysis builds on the previous 3 State of the System reports. So what we're trying to do is get a longitudinal idea of performance, of how things are improving or getting worse over time. There is a lot of discussion about, the system. Is it a system? Is it an ecosystem? What do we mean by the system? I'd just like to address that first, as that is the construct, of course, that we're considering. And to make it very clear that when we talk about the system, we are talking about those organizations which are explicitly funded to conduct humanitarian action. And that it is those organizations and the funding that is holding those organizations together, as well as a certain sort of basis, institutional basis, and basis of rules and principles and humanitarian law. That's what makes it a loose system. However, we're not saying, when we talk about the state of the system, that the system is all there is. And in a minute, I'll go on to talk about the importance of non-system actors. So the actors with whom, if you like, the formal system works so often in a variety of different combinations to make humanitarian activity work. The reason that we focus on the system as, if you like, the formal system and not the broader actors, including military, civil defense, private sector, and so on, is because the system is at least amenable to looking at. We can get the data for it in a way that we really can't get the data for all of the other actors, not yet, anyway. So it's not a short report. You have, many of you, I think, have this short version, but the long version, which you might have seen, is about 100,000 words. It's about 300 pages, and therefore has all kinds of uses in the field for swatting mosquitoes and all sorts of stuff as well. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, the whole report now, although it is available online, chapter by chapter, if you wish to download it. Instead, I want to look at 3 main areas. The first of those areas, humanitarian need in the past 3 years. The second, resources that were available to address those needs. And the third, some of the key trends in humanitarian performance. Taking them in turn. Humanitarian need. Well, by the end of the period, so that's by December 2017, the number of people in need, estimated to be in need of humanitarian assistance, external humanitarian assistance, not necessarily provided by the government, was a staggering 201 million people. That is the highest number recorded to date. And the number of people forcibly displaced by conflict and violence had also increased over the period, reaching 68.5 million, so also a staggering figure. Nearly 2/3 of those people, thank you. Nearly 2/3 of those people were IDPs. But the big increase was in refugees, as you know. The increase between the last state of the system and this in number of refugees was 33%, so massive over a 3-year period. Now, these needs were driven particularly by large-scale conflict, primarily in Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, and Iraq. Shall I try this? Yeah. I think this might work. Let's give that a go. It works. Perfect. Thank you. Sorry, I'll just flash forward a little bit. There we are. Thank you. In fact, as you see here, half of all international assistance by dollar value went to just these 4 crises. And this intensified the trend of funding, which we've seen over the past 10 years, of funding being increasingly concentrated in large crises and increasingly concentrated in the Middle East. The proportion, not the total, but the proportion going to the Middle East has increased over the past decade, and the proportion going to sub-Saharan Africa has significantly decreased. 80% of funding is now spent in countries experiencing conflict, and I think it's important to recognize that many of these countries are not just experiencing conflict, but they have a toxic mix, if you like, of conflict, crisis related to natural hazard, and in many cases they are also hosting refugees as well. So that is the sort of context very often, as you know, that we're looking at. In fact, pure, if you like, natural hazard related crises accounted for only 2% of the spend over the period. Now, not only did need grow, but I think very importantly, in this period, we saw new and different kinds of need and different kinds of crisis emerge. One example was what has been called broadly the European migration crisis. We use inverted commas because many people would feel actually that is an opportunity rather than crisis. The people who were coming into Europe, of course, had a very broad range of needs, from pure life-saving as they crossed the Mediterranean to dealing with bureaucracy, identification papers and so on when they arrived in Europe. And these needs were taking place off the shores of, or on the territory of, some of the richest countries on earth. And frankly, the international community didn't really know what to do with that. Found it very difficult to orient its ways of working to working in metropolitan Europe. Similarly, in some ways, although different in others, was of course the Ebola crisis, where, you know, this was a new and unexpected thing for many humanitarian agencies, which initially many saw as a health crisis, and so kind of somebody else's problem. And identifying exactly both what the role of the humanitarian system was and how it would fulfill that role was very difficult and took several months. Of wasted time. Of course, the humanitarian system did make a very significant contribution to the decrease in morbidity eventually, but it took some time to do so. So let's turn to the second element of the presentation, resources. Against the backdrop that I've sketched out, increased needs, new kinds of needs, the resources did continue to grow, reaching a new peak of 27.3 billion US in 2017. But there were signs that these rapid increases were tailing off. So there was a very sharp rise in 2014-15, so before this period, but as you can see here, the increases in this period were unusually small, at about 3% a year. And that's less than we've seen at any time in the past 10, 12 years. And of course, going out of the state of the system into 2018, the FTS suggests that actually the amount of money is falling, and that's the first year that that has occurred. And although funding increased, as we've seen, so did needs, which meant that the gap between need and resource basically stayed the same over the period. Now, I recognize this is not perhaps the most legible of the graphics in the presentation. The black ball at the top is need as outlined in the Common Appeals, UN Common Appeals. The red bars are the resources that went to those needs. And look at the bottom, which is the pie chart. You can see that from about 2012 onwards, the proportion of needs met by resources stays about the same. It's about 60%, or a gap of about 40%. So what you've seen is a constant increase both in needs and in resource, and the gap stays the same. Let's look at who was doing it. Well, it was you guys. In terms of major operational agencies, you know, there weren't really any significant changes. Most donor funding continued to go in the first instance to the UN, particularly WFP, HCR, and UNICEF. And much of this then went on at the second level to NGOs, particularly INGOs, which meant that, as in 2015, again, the expenditure of the NGO sector and of the UN in humanitarian action was about equal. the two parts of the sector state spent about the same. NGO funding continued to be concentrated among a small number of international agencies. As you can see here, the 6 largest agencies, oh sorry, it's not there, is it? The 6 largest agencies received about a quarter, or spent rather about a quarter of the NGO total. Now, in contrast, and I think we'll talk about this in a minute, all national and local NGOs received only 1.4% of the total first level funding that went to NGOs, and actually 0.4% of all humanitarian funding at the first level. They will have received more indirectly at the second level from UN agencies and NGOs, but directly this of course fell far short of some of the aspirations of the grand bargain. So let's take a breath here. Reflect on what this tells us. I think there's 4 key points here. Firstly, the shortfall between requirements and financial contributions is not getting any smaller. And as needs continue potentially to increase and funding potentially to decrease, the gap is only going to perhaps get bigger. Secondly, growth in global humanitarian funding has plateaued, and that is a new thing. Thirdly, funding is becoming ever more concentrated in a small number of large conflict-related crises, particularly in the Middle East. And finally, the financial architecture, so who provides the money and who spends it, is basically constant. The picture is one of very little change since the last period. I'll come back to these later. But before I do, I'd just like to look at the third element, which is performance. How was this money spent? How did we do? Not going to look at all of the 10 criteria considered in the report, but instead look at some that I think are particularly important. The first of these, the geopolitical landscape, you will have noticed, changed significantly in the period 2015 onwards. There was a political shift from multilateral cooperation and a rules-based order supportive of international humanitarian law. Now, the shift's always been, the order has always been challenged, but I think there was a really significant change here, because what we saw was that the challenge to IHL and more broadly to the principles of humanitarian action became much more intense. And it was also often related to, or indeed coming from, states, and states that had previously been very supportive of some of these principles. And what that did, according to many people we spoke to in the field, was it emboldened refugee hosting governments and governments in conflict to push back as well. Now, I think it's important to remember that we can't just blame this on politicians, pleasing as it might be to do so. Politicians seem to have been amplifying and reflecting popular mood. There was a poll by the ICRC done in the late 90s and again, which showed a really significant drop in support for the principles and for international humanitarian law between the late 90s and now, which suggests that people in the P5 nations particularly are becoming, less keen on the laws of war. And one consequence of this was that under pressure from governments, north and south, many agencies, as you'll know, found it much harder to act in accordance with humanitarian principles. And another consequence was that the ability of those agencies to reach people in need and the ability of people in need to reach humanitarian assistance declined. Governments pushed back a lot more, and they often used new, more bureaucratic tactics to do so. We saw a massive increase, particularly in Yemen, but in quite a lot of different scenarios, of gumming up the works using bureaucracy to prevent access, rather than the kind of harder pushback. But the problem of access was not just a problem of armed actors. Many evaluations and many interviewees spoke about their own agencies becoming more risk averse and less comfortable, less prepared to act in situations of conflict, or indeed in pandemic situations such as Ebola. So it's not good news. Overall, the report says that humanitarian performance in 2 key areas, coherence with international law and principle, and the ability to reach everybody in need decreased over this 3-year period. Or to put it another way, the world has got less good at keeping to the agreements that it has made and less good at providing assistance to the people who need it most. On a more positive note, for those who could access life-saving assistance, what we saw, particularly in sort of the early phase crisis and in the short term, was that humanitarian activities were generally effective, they were generally timely, and they were generally of at least acceptable quality. And in these situations also, we were told that humanitarian assistance was at its most relevant and appropriate. And in fact, rather wonderfully, the evidence we were able to collect suggests that humanitarians are getting better at saving lives and decreasing disease morbidity than in previous periods, particularly in these short-term urgent situations. With regard to protection, the situation was a bit more mixed than with assistance. Certainly there were some positives. Agencies, donors were becoming much more aware of the issues and were engaging more with the issues. And there were lots and lots of very good examples, isolated but good examples on the ground of agencies doing positive things. But the big constraint here seems to be the constraint of prioritization. Because protection covers so much, GBV, child protection, mine action, identification, all of these things. In many responses, it appeared to be very hard for the response and agencies to actually identify what the priorities should be and really bear down on those. But overall, the report suggests that effectiveness and relevance, those two criteria, have got better since the end of 2014. So the last thing I'd like to do, rather than going through all of the criteria, is bear down on 3 areas. And I've chosen these 3 areas on the screen because these were areas where, under the WHS and the Grand Bargain, the humanitarian system consciously said we would make these things better. So the question is, in the admittedly short period of time, because the WHS was 2016, so it hasn't been very long, did we? Turning initially to accountability and participation. Well, the first thing the report shows is how important these activities, this approach to programming is. Statistically, in the recipient survey, we looked to see if there was any correlation between those people who said that they had been able to engage, those recipients who've been able to engage, and the sense around the quality of aid. And what we saw was that those people who've been able to engage were statistically 3 times more likely to say that they'd been treated with dignity and respect than people who had not been able to engage. And they were also 2 to 3 times more likely to give positive responses about the relevance and the quality of the aid they'd received. And so, rather wonderfully, I think, what the report has shown is something that we have, suspected, but sometimes found it rather hard to evidence, that there is a straight line link between, now the nature of that link we could contest, but there is a straight line link between the degree to which people are engaged and able to participate and in humanitarian response, and the perception they have of the quality and of the way that they're treated. Now, how do we do? Well, there may be a little bit less positive. The report shows there's a lot more going on. There are a lot more feedback activities, mechanisms being set up, and so on. A lot more people said a lot more recipients said they'd been engaged in assessment and in monitoring. But there was also, particularly among colleagues in the field, a significant and growing level of cynicism about these activities. More people are being consulted, yes, but many colleagues felt that this was becoming a kind of box tick exercise. They pointed to the fact that the consultation very seldom led to significant programmatic change. Minor changes, yes, but significant change, no. And also to the fact that, particularly on the side of accountability, the accountability mechanisms that have been set up are largely data and information collection mechanisms. They don't actually generally have any teeth. And so there's not really anything, all of this information is collected, but very little in terms of sanctions or constraints occurs. And so a lot of our colleagues are questioning the value of these activities. Moving on, localization. Again, I think the recipient questionnaire provided some really interesting context. Firstly, it showed the importance, and I go back to those agencies who are not part of the formal system. It showed the importance. Over half the recipients said that they had received, the main assistance that they had received came from national or local entities, compared to about a third from international entities. So, localization and the idea that, the local is coming into the game, obviously is just flat wrong. They've always been there, and they are actually the biggest part of the game. But it also broke down, I think, some of the assumptions that we easily make about this kind of national, some of the way we frame the national, international discussion. Because when, again, we ran tests for significance and for correlation, there was no significant difference in the responses around quality or relevance between those people who had received assistance from internationals and those who'd received assistance from nationals, which I think should lead us to question whether the distinction is really between one homogeneous group of internationals and one homogeneous group of nationals, or whether the distinction is actually between the good agencies and the bad ones. Now, in terms of performance, the relation between international actors and governments did seem to improve on all of the metrics that we were looking at, and that continued the improvement that we've seen over the past 6 years, but there was much less movement with respect to the relationship between international actors and local civil society, national civil society and NGOs. The issue's definitely risen up the agenda, and there's more discussion at policy level, but not so far any significant changes, not just in funding, but also in relationships broadly were reported to us on the ground. And then the third area where there was a conscious intention to change was the relationship, of course, between development and humanitarian activities, and the way that humanitarian activities contribute to addressing underlying need. And there were some successes here, particularly where humanitarian actors worked as part of larger, nationally state-led activities around safety net programs, for example, in Kenya. But elsewhere, there was very, very little evidence that resilience activities done outside kind of the framework of the state had any effect, really, at all. Struggled to have any, to really get at the underlying driving crises. There were a lot more programs in this area, but their effectiveness, I think, was very questionable. And when we go beyond resilience to look at other developmental areas, in particular protracted and long-term engagement, again, we saw no improvement over this period, unlike the improvement we saw in the kind of short-term the effectiveness of the protracted long-term work did not improve, didn't necessarily get worse, but it didn't improve. However, while the humanitarian system did not really do much in the area, sort of these developmental areas, there were big changes going on, and you'll be aware of these. There seems to be a very big shift in terms of donor governments and international financial institutions coming into this refugee space, coming into this protracted emergency space, providing funding and, in some cases, project work. And in many situations, those activities, large in scale though they were not particularly related to humanitarians. So the long-term lack of communication between humanitarian and development sectors continues, but perhaps becomes more acute now that the development sector, after years of us saying, where are you? Well, they're here. But the communication is not necessarily improving. To summarize, in the period 15 to 17, we saw significant, rapid, and unexpected change in the context in which we work. And set against that, we saw a formal architecture that really didn't change very much. Same donors, same key actors, same inability of funding to meet all needs. A lot of the structural stuff is the same. We saw some very important improvements, particularly around the effectiveness of life-saving assistance. But the things that we loudly and confidently set out to improve really didn't change very much. However, important new actors did come into what has traditionally been humanitarian space, international financial institutions, but also, I think it's worth pointing out, a lot of Chinese NGOs, a lot of Indian NGOs working in the Kathmandu Valley, for example. A lot of civil society organizations in Europe working in Greece, France, also outside Europe as well. I'm less acquainted with that. So new actors, newly acknowledged actors, playing a very significant part. And in conclusion, I think what we can say is a gap is opening up between the rapid rate of change in the world and the slow rate of change at which the humanitarian system adapts. It's not hard to imagine that this could go in a variety of different directions between now and the next report in 2021. But whichever of those directions it goes in, we have got quite a lot of thinking to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Thank you. I think you put a finger on a lot of challenges that we have in the sector, and it does ring a bell to, I think, every practitioner or even academic in the room. A lot of challenge. What I took note of is, yes, unexpected or new crisis and getting more and more complex that we need to respond to. And yes, there's less money. We can feel that is clear. It's becoming a more competitive sector for every organization, and we are asked to have more and more code of conduct and requirements to be able to respond, and more capacities in global. So yes, it's hard it's hard for organizations to adapt to every crisis, because that's what we are asked to do, to be better every time and better analyze the needs, better respond. So a lot of challenge, and also there is a forgotten crisis, because yes, as we can see, the funding go to the big emergency that the media usually talks a lot about. So there's a lot to talk, but I think we can underline the methodology of this research, because it's a lot of work. We can see that there's been a lot of effort for this research, and that's what Françoise Audet comment too. That if we had a peer review for this research, it would have very good comment, because there's been a lot of effort to contact beneficiaries, local NGO, international NGO, everyone in the community who's been involved in the crisis. So thank you for this, because this gives a very good portrait of the sector. So we're going to have our panelists, because we have one big issue that we can maybe explore a little bit. So I will start with you, Marie-Claude. Marie-Claude Savard, she is a PhD candidate at UQAM University in Montreal, and she's also the associate director of OCCAH. We have Simran Singh. She's the director of global strategy and gender equality at CARE. And we have Stacey Sawchuk. I'm sorry, I didn't ask you if I spell your name correctly.
Yeah,
is it? Yeah. Thank you. She's the humanitarian program manager at Action contre la faim. So we're gonna try to have a conversation. So maybe the first topic that we can explore is the gender one, because it came from a few people. Gender equality in general, and how we analyze different needs for women, for men, boys, girls, and also for marginalized group in general, because we can talk about religious group, minority, and also people living with a disability that can easily be forgotten when there is a crisis. So gender seemed not to be enough present in that report. Maybe it could have been more present in every section, because that's also what we are asked to do as practitioners in the sector. So maybe we can develop a little bit for each of you. So if you can take a few minutes and talk about gender in this report and what you think about it.
Okay. So I would really encourage everyone to read some of the 344 pages because it does go into a little bit more detail around gender. And put simply, the report essentially says that we still struggle after so many years to meet the specific needs of women and girls, the elderly, and people with disabilities. There has been some movement around policy and taking that and more policy around that. And CARE specifically, in the CARE as well as a lot of other NGOs, have been looking at what do we see as a disconnect? We have policies, we have tools, we have technical specialists, but why are we still consistently struggling to implement strong gender programming at field level? And so we asked ourselves this question around 6 months ago, and my colleagues and we, sat around, had long conversations about this, where not all of us agreed. But essentially what came out of that is we're still not listening to women's voices effectively. We are still not working with women's rights actors consistently. And when we don't do that, we're losing the effectiveness of our humanitarian response. And that's led to CARE working with a lot of other NGOs to come up with this very clear statement of where we see some of the gaps, which is on the CARE website, if anyone's ever interested to read it. But it goes into detail around basic things like the humanitarian response plan. When that gets developed at field level, oftentimes women's rights actors are not involved in the development of analysis. They're not getting the funding when it comes to country-based pool funds. So we hear from partners like an organization working in South Sudan, that their funding, which was providing support in I think Bentu to support GBV programming, was cut after 6 months. And that is one of the most effective things that you can be doing in that context, but they're not being prioritized. They're not being seen as a need. So we still have to do a lot more work. We have come a long way in the last couple of years, but there is a lot more to be done around working with women's rights actors, listening to women more consistently. And as Paul pointed out, when you are listening and there is accountability, the assistance that we're providing is more respectful and more dignified. So I'll leave it at that and let Stacey.
Yeah, thanks. Just to build on some of that work too, I think something that comes out more and more each day that a lot of us are working on is really breaking down those technical silos. So understanding that regardless of what technical or thematic area you're working in, whether it's water and sanitation, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's nutrition, like Action Cultural FM, gender and gender equality and GBV actually underpins your ability to succeed in any type of response, whether it's humanitarian or development. So short-term and long-term, everything that we do on the ground has an impact, and it has a gendered impact that's different between men and women and on girls and boys. So it's not that you need to necessarily focus as your organization. That may not be your mandate to target one of those groups specifically, but you need to understand those impacts in order to have an actual response that's going to be effective. And I think that's something that when you look at a report such as this, which details a lot of suggestions, or out of it you can get a lot of suggestions and recommendations on how to strengthen our programming. For me, it also comes down to how are we actually analyzing success using a gender lens. So, how are these things that we're saying, this is good impact, this is bad impact, this is success, this is not success, we need to improve this. What kind of lens have we used to determine that? Is that actually reflective of what women on the ground need, considering that we know over the last few decades, they've been completely left out of the picture of determining how the system works. So the humanitarian system as a whole, we know it has an extreme gender bias. We as organizations that are working on it day to day, aside from with our communities, our internal organizations really struggle with that. And we really struggle to understand internally how our organizations can improve this. We all know to say these words. We all know that we need to include them in our proposals and our reports, but it's super superficial. It's not actually meaningful for most of the part. There's very few times where you can see a really good example of this, and we're too scared to share our failures and the actual real impacts of these things on the people on the ground, specifically for women, elderly, disability, anyone that's been left out of the wide response. And so I think looking at gender specifically in emergencies, we can do more, one, at a research level in drawing that out more clearly. As an organizational level, we can make sure that we understand that these things exist and actually talk about them. And I think then on the ground in the communities, obviously with more transparency and accountability, we can help to improve this for the community as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and to go to more than a box clicking, I like the expression. So yeah, Paul, do you have any reaction regarding this topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's looking at the data that we had for the state of the system, it's a rather strange triangulation, because when we looked at the data from the recipient survey and broke it down by gender, what we actually saw was that there were, with the exception of only 14% of the questions showed any kind of difference in terms of the gender of the respondent, which surprised me, actually. And those were questions about feedback and dignity generally, rather than questions about the quality or relevance of aid. Surprising, I think. So on the one hand, you know, the recipients, those who answered the questions in the 5 countries that we looked at, were not giving a strong message that they felt that the aid they received was not relevant or not of acceptable quality. Then the second piece of the triangulation, if you like, was all of the stuff that was going on at policy level. You know, all of the gender marketing and lots of really good work by many of the agencies, I think, here and many others. And so, you know, you take those two things, you think, well, the picture's not that bad. But then you look at some of the case studies and the evaluations of the actual work that's being done, and it's shameful, you know, in terms of the basics not being there. You know, and this is not about gender empowerment. This is about whether, you know, whether people have thought about the safety of people going to latrines. Still, you know, still those basics, those. And I'm not sure how those 3 things triangulate with each other. Maybe it's something that, you know, you could explain. So, so there is definitely that, you know, the figures and the description seem to be saying something rather different.
I'm wondering if it's the questions that you're asking, because if you're not asking the right questions, you will get, like, and we've struggled with that when we're doing assessments or when we're doing a rapid gender analysis. You have to be really specific and understand the context and ask questions that can get those answers to come out. Again, it's hard when you're trying to do it at such a large scale and that sort of thing. But I haven't read your questions, I wouldn't know. Yeah. But I'm curious around if there's something around what we're asking.
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible.
I also think too that gender inequality and, for example, GBV are so normalized into society that most people wouldn't even recognize that as a problem. So when you're asking questions on these things, it wouldn't occur to them to say, this is an issue that's gendered. And I don't know if it would come out so easily.
And I think that's, I do think I think there's various layers here. You know, there's if you like, there's the empowerment piece at the highest level. And that obviously for many humanitarians is very challenging, because it's, you know, it does bring up, are we in the transformation business, or are we in the putting things back the way they were business? You know, so a lot of agencies, I think, find that very difficult. You know?
Yeah.
But sorry, just to finish it, but sort of going down, you then have issues which are very highly gendered, GBV, for example. But actually, some of the things I'm talking about aren't even those. They're just WASH programs consistently thinking they're being innovative because they've included menstrual hygiene. Right? I mean, and I'm not kidding. I mean, that is seen as an innovation, really. You know, it's that kind of quality, just the basic difference in need at the very lowest level that I think is interesting.
WASH is a good example, because all of us know that story of the access to the latrine, like the lights, the locks on the doors, but very few people then go to think that a basic need is actually a shelf inside the bathroom and a hook inside the bathroom and soap. Things like that donors and organizations and people just fail to think that's a basic necessity versus an extravagant luxury in a crisis. And when you're a woman and you're menstruating and you have nowhere to put your clothes that you're washing and drying, like, what do you do?
And I think when I was talking about integrating gender consistently, it is actually what you're talking about right now. It's the have we done the lights? Where are the latrines? Have you thought about distribution? Have you broken down the distribution packages so it's easy for women to carry it down? And that's where we still, like, even with the empowerment, I agree, like that's something collectively we have to figure out what makes sense in our context, but it is that basic have we thought about, you know, shelter or wash or that sort of thing that we still don't do consistently when we're doing a hygiene package or something like that. And that's still surprising that we're struggling with that so many years later.
Yeah, and also to understand the different needs for women and girls, because they also are different. And when we have an intersectional approach, we can also have better comprehension, understanding of the local needs.
And boys and men, because in contexts like Yemen, boys and men were disproportionately affected because they weren't allowed to leave the house. So we need to have a proper gender analysis in place that looks at everything across the board and takes into consideration what has this led to an impact, which then in theory should lead to better programming in theory if we listen to our analysis.
And so do you think, to make a link with another topic, so where do you think is the struggle? Do you think is the local partners who has difficulties to implement this kind of strategy, or what do you think it comes? Because I want to talk about localization because it's in the report. So we could explore a few topics around localization, because in the report we only talk about the financial. Local organizations get only 1.4% of funding, which is tragic. The Grand Bargain showed that, and a lot of local organizations got the occasion to claim for equality also in the work. But also the other interesting point I found was there is more local workers. So we have the two facts. So maybe you can respond to localization if you want to start, Marie-Claude, because you didn't speak yet.
Well, my reading on localization was from a managerial perspective. My research center is based out of a management school. We may be the only research center on humanitarian aid that's based out of a management school. So I was mostly interested in direct funding. So as you said, and as the report highlights, which I've read from cover to cover, including the bibliography. So yes, I'm a nerd.
There's a special certificate.
I will expect it then. So I'm interested in direct funding. So of course, because of the period that's covered by this report, we can't expect to see any significant changes. The Grand Bargain commitment of 25% direct funding was only made in 2016. But I'm a bit of a pessimist in thinking that we're not going to achieve the 25% target by 2020. And the reason I say this is because a lot of agencies and organizations and donors are now using the word as directly as possible, or using the terms as directly as possible instead of direct funding. And I think that when this conversation was initiated, the idea was really to support localization, to enhance the financial capacity and autonomy of local responders through direct funding. So you've got a donor, and then you've got the local responder. Donor provides funding to the local responder. End of story. That's direct funding. But what we're seeing now is people are accepting the term as directly as possible, and to me that's a bit of a compromise. So as directly as possible means reducing as many layers of intermediaries as possible, but not reducing them altogether. So most funding now is going through several layers of intermediaries, and I looked at this from a managerial perspective, and what I see is there's a managerial challenge here, which may hinder the achievement of the 25% target. And this is because, in my opinion, donors and local responders and NGOs work with very different managerial logics. So you've got the donors that are large bureaucratic organizations that develop trust in subcontracting organizations or NGOs through a demonstration of competence, through technical competence and managerial competence, and through contracts. So a donor will trust you as an NGO if you've demonstrated that you're skilled, that you're competent, and you go through great lengths to argue that in your proposals. And then once you've signed a contract, the donor will trust that you will do what you said you would do. Meanwhile, the NGOs are developing very different types of relationships with local responders, and those relationships are based on goodwill trust. So it's another form of trust. The donor relies on competency-based trust, and the NGO relies on goodwill trust with the local responders, and that's based on communication, It's based on shared contact in the field, working together. So two very different mechanisms. And the control mechanisms that are deployed in this relationship are very different. So the donor will make sure that the project is being carried out according to plan through audits and through reporting, whereas the NGO working with local responders controls that project or makes sure that it's taking place according to the plan through communication, through interpersonal contact, through site visits, but very casual site visits. So it's different mechanisms at place. And because of that, there's a trust gap that's created. So donors don't trust local responders. And that's why this direct funding isn't happening as easily as we would like it to see. There has to be an intermediary to broker that trust relationship between donors and local responders. And those are the NGOs. NGOs are playing this role, which is a very important role of brokering trust. And I don't know if anybody wants to add about their experience in their own organization about that.
No, I think that those are fantastic points. And I think that really is, it goes to show that our Western way of organizing and our Western way of creating the humanitarian system, how it exists now, isn't necessarily the best suited for other contexts and countries, but we're forcing it on them. And so by putting in these management systems that we have in place, for auditing and reporting, that is the role of INGOs these days. We really are intermediaries, especially in a country like Canada. Like here's all of us sitting here in our headquarters or, income generating offices for fundraising. It goes back to realizing that we're doing things in one way and our partners and the people on the ground are doing things how they do things their way. So you either are unsuccessful, hopefully, but because you're trying to enforce your system on them, or we actually realize the fact that we don't need to empower them. They have a lot of capacities already. And really, they should be empowering us. And we're the ones that are in the middle, learning from them how they do it, how it's supposed to be done, how can we work together to be producing something that's, a successful humanitarian response, but in a way that's more meaningful for them in the long term, because they're the ones that are going to be staying there. We're the ones that are leaving. We should be learning from them and doing that two-way learning versus just coming in with a system and structure and saying, this is it, and you need to be empowered, you need capacity to be built. And I do think it also goes back to what the donors think is a good quality project and accountability and transparency. I think it also links into those aspects as well, because again, we're bringing in a very Western view of what things should look like. So in the field, you might not have a book with numbers as a ledger for your accounts because your women's organization, the community group, say they have dots or numbers or bottle caps that they've kept, and they know if they have 10 bottle caps, it's equivalent to like $50. But our auditing books don't accept that as an appropriate means of financial management. And that's upsetting because that group has really strict policies and procedures and is really successful and has great impact, but we don't recognize it as being something that's a positive response.
Can I add to what she was saying too around, I think, you made an interesting point around trust with INGOs and local partners, but I would argue that the donor has a certain compliance requirements that would then gets dropped down to us and then gets brought down to local partners. And so then that influences what kind of local partners we can work with. And that means that we have a harder time working with local partners that are more like women's rights actors or like that, because there's an issue with scale. And then also the risk issue as well, like we are devolving risk down. And I think within CARE, we're looking at how do we move beyond transactional partnership, where we're like, here's a contract, you need to do X, Y, and Z, an actual true partnership where it's a two-way learning. And I think as organizations collectively, we still have a long way to go to change the way we work and change those power dynamics and devolve power away from INGOs to local organizations, and challenge our own biases when it comes to that. Because I can catch myself saying stuff like, oh no, I have the technical capacity, but I don't know what's happening in a small context or somewhere like in Niger. I don't, that's not what I understand. And so really challenging our own internal biases when we are working with local partners is really critical.
Yeah. There's it just made me think of a piece of research when you were talking about the layers, and the potential role of international NGOs, and when you were talking about accountability, I think it's important to remember, exactly as you were saying, that in some, albeit not all cases, what HPG found, I think, was that there was a real value in the INGO role in that relationship, in that layer, if you like. It's not all redundancy. But what they also found was that it's very hard to say what the value is because the INGOs are really not very transparent with their numbers. And so, you know, in some ways opening this, you know, these discussions require a little bit more data and a little bit more openness about, you know, quite how the money is flowing through agencies. But if I may just say another slightly different thing about localization, I'm really stuck on, I can't quite get past the, what I think are the very interesting findings about the relative degree, the relative quality of the response from international and national. Similarly, I would say similar findings around coherence with principles. You know, I think we've got to get rid of this idea that internationals are necessarily more principled than national actors, because we really couldn't find very much evidence for that one at all. You know, there's plenty of not very principled internationals and plenty of very principled nationals. So this, I guess, the thing that I take from this is I'm slightly concerned about the way this whole conversation is being framed. You know, that firstly, this kind of attempt to say national, international, you know, obviously they are different, but I think we need to investigate that a bit more. Secondly, I think it's really weird that we talk about national organizations as being some kind of homogenous block, you know, when it could be a football team, or it could be a women's group, or it could be something that looks a lot more like a humanitarian organization, or it could be a boys' club, or, you know, all of these things are working as humanitarian organizations, and to say, oh, you know, national NGOs are like this or they're like that, I think that's just a bit weird. And the third piece about the framing I think we need to be careful of is, you know, not turning a conversation that is actually about people's capacity to organize and respond to their problems into a conversation about us again. There is a bit of the whole kind of localization that is not really starting from the national organization saying, you know, what do you exist to do? What are you for? Yeah, what are your problems? But it is instead about what's the nature of the relationship that we have with national organizations. I don't know if that makes sense to all of you, but it concerns me that for the best reasons, I'm sure, we have slightly perverted the conversation so we can talk about ourselves a bit more.
Can I say something about that? This is actually one of CECI's partners that was that said during a conference. This is your Philippine partner that said, well, nobody asked us if we agreed with the 25% target, or if we what we think of direct. Nobody asked us what we think of direct funding.
Yeah, that's right. That's a whole inherent biases that we have here in HQ or in that we think what people want, but if we're not asking, and I think it'll be really interesting to see the studies that come out of Indonesia with the Sulawesi response, because that we all had to work in a different way. We weren't allowed, and INGOs weren't allowed to go into the field, so we had to work differently with local partners. And Indonesia is a middle-income country which already had a significant amount of capacity. So it's interesting. I'm really curious to see what comes out of that and how that informs our discussion moving forward.
Sorry, I think it also links into the system and the donors too. So when Fiji was hit with one of its bigger hurricanes in the last few years, donor agencies in Australia had already been successful in receiving funding from the government. So they were going out to their local partners who they had some sort of relationship with already to say, this is what we have funding for, let's do it. That's not asking. No. So they were essentially being dictated to what the response was going to be. There was very few agencies, and I think it was documented only one actually went to the organization and country and said, what do you need? And then worked backwards from that.
We did a really interesting piece of work, colleague of mine, with some national civil society organizations a couple of years ago, not related to the state of the system, but it was in Colombia and Lebanon, and it was, you know, actually asking them to talk about themselves. And for me, I think one of the most important, you know, kind of denominators of those two, and it was only these two countries, was that really, when they talked about themselves, they didn't really talk about us very much. You know, it wasn't, they had bigger fish to fry. You know?
How could they not be thinking about us at all
I know,
times?
it's gutting, actually, but, you know, a lot of it was about civil society. It was about space. It was about the relationship to government. And again, I think that question, you know, taking maybe just an academic thing, but maybe problematizing that question a little bit would be quite helpful.
Yeah, and inequality in the power decision too in the process. Yeah, so we'll have to cut the party soon, but I just want to ask one last question, if you can respond very quickly. Because we are in Canada, because this is the HRN, I just want to ask maybe our three panelists, I don't know, Paul, if you have an idea on this, but what is the Canadian specificity? What do we have to bring into the world, in the humanitarian sector, in terms of good practices? What do you think, very shortly?
I mean, I think some of us might have noticed, might think that the world is getting worse, yeah? And some parts of it are getting worse quicker than others. So I think, you know, Canada has a very, very important role to play, which is essentially its traditional role around rights, around gender, very particularly, and around support to international humanitarian and refugee law.
Thank you. Yeah, the other panelists?
I mean, I agree with what Paul is saying. I think we've seen a rise in intolerance and racism and misogyny and all those things. And I think Canada has a role to play, has brought a really strong voice around gender. When you think about the Whistler Declaration, the follow-up meeting, all the work that's been done, I think that's really critical to continue doing work and saying, you know, calling out what we need when it comes to SRHR and talking about sexual and reproductive health rights and not watering down that conversation or not watering down conversations around gender-based violence and women's rights. I think that's a really important role we need to continue to play.
Yeah, I think funding of data to inform the humanitarian system is key.
Marie-Claude?
I think that Canada has there are a lot of Canadian organizations that started off as development organizations and that have transferred over since the 1980s and 90s towards more humanitarian programming, humanitarian response. And those organizations are producing really interesting hybrid interventions that are more nexus, so they're bridging the gap between emergency response and development programming. So they're able to do that, and that's an important contribution that several Canadian organizations are doing. However, there are some challenges with funding, because as we know, the Canadian government, or Global Affairs Canada, is separated into different branches. So there's the humanitarian funding and then there's development funding. So if you're trying to do something that's a little bit of both, difficult to get funded. So I think as organizations, you have a potential to contribute to the evolution of Canadian policy. So you can participate in dialogue with the Canadian government to see about broadening that definition of what emergency response is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all of you. We'll open to the audience if we already have a hand. Okay, so
There's a mic there.
yeah, there's one over there, or I can give you.
Or we can probably hear.
Huh?
I can project.
Yeah, good.
Oh, what did I do? I can't like keep on.
The securitization of humanitarian aid and how that's reflected in the delivery response that NGOs and I guess national organizations are trying to
No, I don't know who wants to
you
answer.
Well, certainly, I mean, sadly, one has to accept for a variety of reasons that a lot of the state of the system is perceptional, you know. Those reasons are partly because a lot of these things are perceptional, but largely because it's very hard to get, if you like, harder data on a lot of stuff in the humanitarian system. So on this, we're really judging on the basis of what interviewees tell us, including interviewees in the case studies from civil society and from affected people. And really, we were trying to test out the hypothesis that this situation, that agencies are becoming more risk averse. which has been put forward by MSF and others, but particularly strongly by MSF. And we didn't find any evidence that that was not the case. Put it that way. Yeah. The arguments that MSF was making around Central African Republic and other similar situations, they, pretty solid. There were smaller numbers of agencies prepared to engage in places that they perceived to be threatening. Often, according to Humanitarian Outcomes, have done some very good work on this under the SAVE Consortium. Often the places that we thought, or the humanitarians thought were threatening, were not places that the local population perceived as being dangerous. So there was a strong mismatch there. And that seemed to come up in the interviews a lot as well. Why aren't they here? There's not a problem here. I think it's a very hard balance. I mean, it was also true in Ebola. That it was, there was a lot, that wasn't so much about, it was about staff security and insurances and the ability of people to evacuate and what that did to the insurance for expatriate staff. I think I don't think you can just say, look, everyone's just being wet, and it's not. I mean, there are real hard constraints. There's another very hard constraint around anti-terror funding. And a lot of the constraint there seems to be not just the funding itself, around which there are many discussions, but many agencies don't fully know what it means. And they, time and time again, we had that. They didn't really know what they could and couldn't do, and therefore were playing it safe. And that playing it safe, of course, leads to, in many situations also not being in certain places. So because of insurance, because of very legitimate concerns about staffing, because of perceptions around anti-terror funding, perhaps because organizations are getting more professional, yes, I think it is fair to say that we are less and less in the places where we need to be most.
Or it takes longer for us to get to the places where we need to go, because CARE is a big organization, we are a large confederation, so if we're moving into an insecure environment, that does take a lot of discourse internally around what are our insurance requirements, how do we ensure our staff is safe, how do we make sure that if we're there, we're not compromising the security of the community as well. And so that may slow us down in a way that we might have not been slowed down 20 years ago, because we're not thinking through what the impact is. But we are seeing that aid workers are increasingly facing a lot more concerns than they have in the last 20 years. And so we need to be more thoughtful about that.
I think there's two levels to it. One's definitely on the donor side. I think donors are risk adverse because their fiduciary department and their actual development departments have different understandings and meanings. We've signed on to the grand bargain, but when you actually put in a report that talks about potential financial misconduct or fraud, you get given a really strong or a degraded risk or organizational rating. But at the same time, you're reporting on it exactly how you're supposed to, and you're told to in advance. You followed procedures and processes. So therefore, it should show that you have strong organizational management to do that. But at the same time, internally, the donors, and this has happened in multiple countries I worked in, the actual donor itself internally doesn't agree. And so they're constantly fighting with themselves. So you don't know if you do report something that's going to have a positive or negative impact. And we're seeing that with the PSEA stuff right now too, right? So the donor really wants to push. We want to know about this. We want mechanisms, we want accountability, we want transparency, we want action on it. Agencies threw a bunch of reports in and everyone's freaking out. No one wants to talk about it. No one knows what to do with it. And so now it's all trying to go back under the table and it's being hidden again. So I think there's the donor side, but then I also think there's the shrinking civil society space. And so we can't mobilize very easily. The insurance risks, the lack of IHL respect, everything's kind of changing in that sense. And so organizationally it's hard. Action Cultural FM tends to work mainly through local staff. So in that sense, they've devolved risk in a different way, which you could see as positive or negative, right? Mm-hmm. So my poor colleagues are the ones facing this stuff day to day. And they're the ones at risk, and they're the ones that tend to get left out of data information on casualties in emergency responses. And it's also another dynamic that we have to actually look at and consider.
Marie-Claude, do you want to add something?
Well, just to add to that, so there are obvious ethical dimensions to that when we're transferring risk down the chain to the local, to local and national staff.
Yeah, that's also one of the challenge of localization too. Do we have another question? Yeah, you were.
No, I'm doing mics.
Sorry?
I'm delivering mics.
Oh, okay. So who had, yes, go ahead.
Actually, I have two questions. One just one just a follow-up to the question that you just answered. Is there any evidence that you've seen that the NRC case, the abduction case, and the findings around that has also contributed to the risk adverseness, or is it more the factors that you have outlined there, and that there's not really any evidence linking those two things? And then, but the bigger question I had was, I was really struck with in the presentation, Paul, about the when you discussed the erosion of support for international humanitarian law, for refugee law, for multiple things, you know, and I see that with, you know, the criminal charges being brought against NGOs in the Mediterranean, against individuals, the criminalization of humanitarian aid, whether it's the increased attacks on healthcare facilities in Yemen and Afghanistan and Syria, and, you know, and particularly, as you mentioned, these are all areas where powers traditionally supportive of humanitarian action are now, their support seems questionable. And I do think we tend to link that with politicians and the political parties as more than populations. But then you brought that up, and I thought that was quite interesting, particularly when we asked, what can Canada do? That's a political solution, as opposed to if it's a population issue or an idea issue. Why do you think that is? Why are people in a broader scheme having a negative attitude towards humanitarian action? And is it only the nationalism stuff, or is it, I mean, interestingly, when we look at the conversation that we're having here, there's a lot of self-criticism, and whether or not we're actually part of the erosion of humanitarian values ourselves, and that we're questioning humanitarian principles fundamentally ourselves. How much is that part of that erosion at the same time? And then as part of that, is it a trend or is this a blip?
Coline, do you want to take a couple questions? Just because I'm cognizant we have 10 minutes, we could probably try to do. Yeah, that's.
One, two. Yeah. I see there's a lot of money being invested in humanitarian aid. Like, it's a lot to me there, billions of dollars. I was wondering, is there a lot of that money invested in permanent solutions, or are we just like kicking the ball in the street and we're always going to have to go get it back, you know?
Yes, resilient activity.
Did you look at the extent to which protection policies were being enforced within the humanitarian sector at the different layers? Like, did you talk to survivors of sexual violence and abuse, whether they were part of the humanitarian sector or beneficiaries? The policies, how well they were being enforced? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll go with those three because we don't have much time. So we have one on politics, one on resilient activities, and one on protection. So if you want to respond quickly, I know it's not easy. Those are big topics.
Paul, I don't know if you want to answer the first question, and I have a shorter answer for his question over there. The one about the NRC case and the criminalization of aid.
The NRC case, no, we didn't find anything. We weren't looking very hard, to be honest, but didn't find anything there. The broader point, perhaps, about the political element. It's that political change is sort of above my pay grade, really. I don't, it's not my specialization. How we, I wish it was, because there's a lot of things that would be good if they were changed, but. I think it's important to recognize that ICRC, for example, would say, or there are parts of ICRC who would say that we are not doing a good job by doing what I've just done. you know, that dwelling on the negative does actually take away the force of the positive story, because there are positive stories as well. So I think, you know, that's a tactical issue. Yes, the situation is currently worse, but against the sort of history of the 20th century, it's still significantly better than it was for much of the 20th century. So there is something about how we tell the story, I think, is part of it. I think there's also, we might be taking a slightly narrow view on what works as well, in terms of our advocacy and so on. We tried to look in this edition of the State of the System at the degree to which things like, you know, rather than just purely political advocacy, the ICC had led to positive change, or individual targeted sanctions in South Sudan had led to positive change. We didn't find very much that was kind of, you know, not equivocal on that. But maybe we just need, as humanitarians, to be thinking a little bit smarter about where the pressure points are and how they can be pushed. And also to be doing that more in combination and less agency by agency, because one of the areas around advocacy that seems to be quite weak is common advocacy at the international level. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, maybe somebody else will want to complete this a little bit.
I wanted to add something about the NRC case. I am based out of Montreal, and in Quebec we have a very tight-knit NGO community, not that many pure humanitarian organizations, but a lot of development organizations, volunteer cooperation organizations, and some hybrids. And there have been 2 incidents in Quebec that drew a lot of media attention, very tragic incidents. And one of them is an ongoing lawsuit. I think it's been 13 or 14 years since Plan Nagua. So a volunteer died in an accident in the field. And 4 or 5 years ago, there was another incident for which NGOs were severely criticized. So there was not a whole lot of awareness of duty of care. There was some among some of the larger organizations, but not among the smaller organizations until that incident occurred 4 or 5 years ago. So the NRC case hadn't really permeated into the Quebecois community, but this particular incident really affected the community. And there was a similar incident fairly recently, and there were no media attacks contrary to the one that occurred 4 or 5 years ago. So the organizations have really stepped up and become more informed about their duty of care. The government is also heavily involved in participating in this process. So what's happened is that a lot of organizations are now much more restricted in what they can do because of a duty of care, but it has yielded positive results.
Yeah, as sad as it is, usually it takes an incident to step up it and to confirm to the sector and all the norms.
And yeah, and those norms are applying not just to expat workers, but also to local staff.
And so it should be equal to everyone, so that the risk is not transferred, as we mentioned before. Maybe we should answer to the second question, which was if the funding goes to permanent action. Maybe I can start the response and somebody can complete.
I can start that question. So I think it's really interesting, and I think it's you have humanitarian response plans that are now 2 years, or in some cases primarily 2 years. So they are looking at more, not permanent solutions, but moving beyond life-saving. Now, having said that, when you look at the Canadian context and what the Canadian donor, what Global Affairs is funding now, it is very focused on life-saving. That is their prime focus when it comes to humanitarian response. So that doesn't enable us to look at what we're calling nexus programming or programming in longer-term protracted crises. So that has been very challenging for us. I think that speaks a little bit to what Marie was saying earlier around the silos that exist right now within Global Affairs between humanitarian and development programming, which doesn't enable us to it's not very easy to find funding that deals with some of the more core issues beyond just like putting a Band-Aid on that situation. Again, it can be context specific, donor specific, but in the Canadian context, that's been a big struggle for us of how do we actually deal with not just the immediate need, but some of the longer term protracted issues that are underpinning the current situation.
And the Global Affairs Canada is increasingly interested in funding over 2-year periods. So this is an improvement towards ensuring
multi-year funding.
Multi-year funding is now becoming more common, as opposed to a few years ago where it was funded for 6 months, maximum a year. But as you're moving towards longer-term funding, you would expect to see, at least as a donor, but as an organization, you would expect to see some longer-term programming, not just saving lives in the short term. And that's where there's sort of a contradiction between the move towards longer-term funding, but also the restriction towards pure life saving.
And what does humanitarian action mean? I think you were talking a little bit around that, where we're looking, if we have longer term protected programming, we're looking at women's empowerment and women's leadership models, which is not a traditional humanitarian thing, and then that doesn't be perceived as life saving. So that kind of inherent tension between when we start moving into programming that looks more development than humanitarian, but that's what makes sense in the context that we're working in.
It's really hard. Like if you wake up and you have no food for your kids and you need to get water, like you don't care if it's called humanitarian or development funding.
Exactly.
You don't, like it's the same needs that you have across the board. So it's how can we reflect that in our structured system?
It's what its most appropriate response.
But I think there are constraints. I mean, it's a great question. But I think it's also important to remember that you said it's a lot of money, and of course it is, but it is also, simultaneously, it's a lot of money, and it's the same amount of money as the US government spent in 3 months on the emergency response to one emergency. And this is being spent globally on the response to, it's not significantly, hugely more than what the world spends on bubblegum every year. So, I think we need to think about the relative amount of money compared to need. Now, the second thing, which is problematic, is in many cases, and this is something that came through yes, it is just kicking the can down the road, because to do anything else would need state structures or government structures of, what are we, remember most of this is in conflict. Yeah. So what you'd want to be doing is contributing to the creation of a health service, contributing to the creation of education that wasn't just doing stuff 1 year, 6 months, that was long term. However, where the state is a combatant and the hospitals and schools are being bombed and not used, the actual doing of that becomes very difficult. Just because it was a great question as well, if I may. Not very much. It did come up. Particularly in the field studies in places like Mali and Bangladesh, but not to the degree that those interviews could form we could actually take any conclusions from those interviews. It's probably something we should do better next time.
Okay, so we went to the other question, right?
Yes.
Somebody else wants to complete a little bit about protection.
What was the protection question again?
Can you say again your question? Maybe, oh yeah.
Oh, wait,
just make sure.
Yeah, it was the one that you had answered.
Yeah.
I was asking about the enforcement of protection policies, whether they came out in the study or not, and to what extent, and whether they looked at the enforcement of these protection policies at the different layers, at the lower level of beneficiaries or even humanitarian actors suffering from or survivors of protection stuff, and at the different levels, basically. So
is the policy being put into practice? Yeah.
Because
is it making a difference?
And what were the findings, if you actually had talked to these different beneficiaries? What were the findings, or what were
I would defer to colleagues here for their experience of is it making a difference?
Well, I think you touched on it, though, in the sense of a lot of it's coming back as superficial, in the sense it's coming back as a feedback mechanism versus real protection, like addressing protection holistically and truly. Because I think a lot of agencies have put in place these mechanisms, and a lot of agencies confuse that as addressing protection.
Yeah, and I wanted to add one more thing, whether you looked at the cases or the number of reported cases of sexual abuse or sexual exploitations by the NGOs at risk, because it has been on the rise, but it's still very limited. And that's part of the enforcement of the PSEA.
No, we didn't. We didn't. And there's some reasons why we didn't, which were largely about the periodicity, but also about data quality and the degree to what is that actually telling you? You know, is it telling you that there's more of it going on, or is it telling you that people are more open to reporting it, or, you know, that maybe I would imagine and hope that it's something that we will need to keep our eye on over this 3-year period.
I think it also speaks a little bit what Stacey was just saying right now around you will, even with gender-based violence, when you have appropriate mechanisms in place, you will see an increase in reporting. That's not because there's an increase in cases, but they're more so people are being more comfortable. And so I think that's what you're probably seeing now with the PSEAs. There's more mechanisms in place. We're catching it more, and that means that where there's more reporting. And now what do we do with that? And you know, one of the things that we've collectively 41 NGOs have come together and said is zero reporting does not mean that's not a good thing. That means we're not doing a good enough job. There's something going on here. So we should not be looking at zero reporting, but we should be looking at what mechanisms are in place. What organizational changes are we making? How do we ensure that we have the right stuff in place? And around protection and GBV, I think we still have a long ways to go. And you know, I refer to this document that we put together, but we looked at GBV and we looked at where were some of the continued gaps. Again, it was around ensuring that we're providing a comprehensive response. And so that's something that I think we still struggle with. We're good at the prevention, but the response still needs work. And that includes a livelihoods component for sure. And it goes again, it's also with SRHR, and like you were saying, you need to be linking to the health systems in order to make change. So I think we've moved forward a lot around a lot of the projection agenda, but it's still around the consistent implementation, which I think is a struggle.
And it begs the fact that we actually need to do more dedicated work on that specifically to make sure that we understand it completely and then integrate it across the wider sector as a whole. But it definitely is underfunded, even though we say it's a priority for a lot of countries. And no one, because it is a really big piece of work and there's a lot of harm that can come out of it if you do it quickly and if you're not an expert in it. So it has to be done properly. And that requires, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the humanitarian agencies aren't those experts. A lot of women's organizations are, and we tend to leave them out of the conversation.
And protection tends to be the most underfunded cluster, just generally.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of topic. I'm sorry, we can't take any more questions because, well, we run out of time. I know you had some more answers to give to.
We have a lot of words. So.
But to conclude, well, we know that there's still a lot of work in the sector that we need to, we need to work on to improve. There's a lot of improvement to happen, and discussion to have also in the sector. So I hope it will go and that we'll have a better report in 5 years. So thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Simran. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Marie-Claude. And we'll have a short break. So if you have an urgent question, you can always come quickly. And I hope you enjoyed the session and that you have a better idea of this report and that we answered your questions. Thank you very much.